Revelation 21:4 is a fascinating text. It says, "And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And there'll no longer be any death, there will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away." What a beautiful picture of heaven. But it's interesting to me that God will wipe away the tear from our eye. That tells me as a pastor that this side of heaven, there's going to be a lot of tears. There's going to be a lot of pain. We're living in a world that is cursed by sin, and we see evidence of that every day. But we also serve a God who has the power now to wipe away our tears, and we're also looking forward to a place where there will be no more tears. There's a big difference between thinking about this is a bad chapter and this is the last chapter. The last chapter for a follower of Jesus Christ is a very, very good one because we serve a God who has the power to wipe away every tear. One of my favorite commentators on the Old Testament made a very unusual statement. He said, "God is the friend of the honest doubter, who has the courage to speak to God instead of about him." And then he went on to say that when I bring my questions and even my complaints to the Lord, that's not a bad thing. That's actually an expression of faith, because I'm saying that I believe God has answers to life's insoluble problems. And so I believe that as we grieve, we need to remind ourselves that being willing to be honest about our questions, that's not a bad thing. There are times in life where I just feel like I'm in the middle of a hurricane, and my feelings are raging. They're all over the map, and one minute I'm sad, one minute I have faith, one minute I have doubt. I'm just all over the map. And that's when it's so important to remind myself I don't live by my feelings alone.
Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to Studio B. No, I am not Pastor Marcus D. Holman. My name is Dr. Marva Hill, and I am here today to introduce you to one of our fantastic guests, and she is going to share a plethora of information about Grieve and Griefshare. I am welcoming to the studio this morning Paulette Bray. Now, I'd like to begin by having Miss Bray give us a little bit of information that follows the credentials behind the name Paulette Bray.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I am a retired school social worker with a license of Master Social Work, and I have been working in the field of social work and especially of family and children for nearly 30 years prior to my retirement. And in that capacity, I've worked at CPS, adoption, in addition to school social worker, and I was also very touched by what happened in my life as a child when I lost my mother at 7, and just chronicling the events that happened with me and my siblings. As a result of that loss, I had 6 siblings. And so when I began my work as a school social worker, I began to look at some of the issues that students were facing in terms of academic success. And I noticed that a lot of students that had lost also had academic and behavior problems. And so I began working and counseling with them. And and that's when my passion began, but I began also to understand the impact of grief. It's a lifelong process. So I was very excited about bringing a grief program to our church, recognizing that a lot of individuals had unresolved grief issues. And so Griefshare became the forum in which we offer a support group that offers help and healing and encouragement to those to recover from the loss of a death of a loved one.
That is very interesting. I remember encountering death in my childhood as well. My grandfather's demise was one of the first ones that I remember. And I remember struggling with what death was all about and how I was supposed to continue in that. Can you share with us some of the kinds of losses that people experience as they journey through life?
Okay, there's several losses that people experience. One that we're talking about now is relationship. And the most prominent of those probably is death, the loss of a loved one. But also people experience losses in relationships in terms of divorce, separations, and when children go off to college, or when there's hospitalizations for a long time, people go into long-term care, when incarceration, that's one we don't talk about. The impact of incarcerations on family. Loss of pet, people get attached to their pets. And anytime you move from a facility or relocation, that's a loss. And then there's psychological losses when people lose self-esteem, self-worth as a result of maybe being in abusive relationships, being in a loss of goals or dreams and security. So when you talk about goals or dreams deferred and people don't achieve those, they go through losses. That's a loss. And loss of emotional support, also material losses, which we see in the loss of possessions, when financial losses, and also in physical loss when we have the loss of our health and issues like that. And physical losses and material losses, like what would result from what we've seen here recently in the freeze, the hurricanes, floods. So those are all kind of losses, and those impact people very significantly in ways that they struggle to try to recover.
Let me ask you this question. When there's a different type of loss, for example, we talked about the losses and the devastation from like the winter freeze and the natural disasters. What is the difference in how you handle the loss of possessions and that kind of devastation as opposed to the loss of a loved one?
Well, the natural response to any of those losses is called grief. And so people are going to grieve the loss, which is a separation of something of significance to them. So the way people grieve is based on a variety of situations, usually the value systems that we have in pertaining to loss, how we handle those things, and what kind of support mainly is around to help people rebound. Sometimes that's why it takes years for people to rebound from those type of losses, because one of the things that occur is the loss of financial security. And so in floods and devastation, natural disasters and things like that, it may take people years to rebound. But likewise, it also will take people years to rebound from a separation of a person, such as death or divorce. So the process is grief in which people react to a loss.
Can you define grief for me and just tell me what are some of the challenges? I think that that's part of the reason that people have problems with dealing with all of it is because there's no real definition. And when you suffer a loss like you did with your mother at age 7, there's not a real definition for a child at that point. So if you can define that for me and then tell us some of the challenges that come with grief.
Okay. It's very simple in definition. It's a reaction. It's a normal reaction to any type of loss. And that reaction is based on emotional, social, physical, intellectual responses. And so the thing with grief is that each person experience it differently. So even in a family, the members of that family react to that loss differently. And so in the situation of a death of a lost one, it's based on the relationship to that person, that if it's a wife that's lost her husband, of course she's going to react differently than the children. And the children's reaction is going to be different based on their relationship with the loved one, as well as the extended family, that person's parents. So it's an individual response, and it's a natural response. And so one of the things that we have to realize and understand about grief, that there is really no right or no wrong way. The authority on grief is the person who is going through grief at that particular time. So we have to take our cues on how to support that person and how to walk along with that person based on the way they are grieving. And we have to be very careful that we don't put judgment on the way that they are grieving. the right way for the person is the way that they are responding. And as long as that way is not destructive, not harmful, and not only to themselves but to other people. And so it may look strange and it may look different to us, but that is what's right for them at that particular time. So we have to come along and support that and give them the encouragement and hope to be able to get through that.
I think that's very insightful. One of the things that you said, I think that's insightful, is that sometimes when a parent is dealing with the loss of a spouse, that there's a different type of relationship as opposed to that a child would deal with. How do you help a parent to deal with the loss of a spouse and then help their children to deal with the loss of a parent? How is that balanced?
It's a difficult one. It really is, because children are often seen as the invisible mourners. Yes. So people don't respond to them like they would with an adult, because the assumption or the myth is that if you don't see them reacting, that they're not impacted by it. And so sometimes children can go about their normal activities or way that would probably send a message to most adults that, oh, they're doing okay, they're doing fine. But that's not the truth. And so a lot of times adults are unable to help children because when they're dealing with their own grief, they don't know how to help children. So they don't know what the child's needs are. And because children are children, they're not able to have the ability to articulate what their needs are. So children take the cues from the adults. So if the adults are not crying, the children get the message that tears are not welcome, don't cry. Or if I do cry, I'm upsetting my parents, so I can't talk to them because that will upset them. And so they either go into themselves or, like I saw as a school social worker, the academics drop, the behavior in school is disruptive. And so they tend to, parents tend to avoid it because they don't know how to. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more children having to encounter grief and death, particularly at a younger age. So 7 out of maybe 10 children now are experiencing the loss of a loved one by the time they graduated from high school.
Wow.
And then we know COVID has really impacted families. So the inability for adults to evaluate and look at what the children's needs are becomes more difficult when they're in their own grief process.
That is very interesting that you said that, especially since we're still in the pandemic. I think that a lot of times it brings to mind, the scripture that says, "In all thy getting, get an understanding." And I think that a lot of times adults have trouble dealing with grief because they haven't gotten that understanding prior to also. So it does make the struggle twice as hard. And with that said, I think that one of the things that we need to definitely emphasize are the 5 stages of grief, because I think that people don't understand what the 5 stages of grief are, and that's the reason that they have problems with it. So if you can, just give us some insight into the 5 stages of grief and how that particular knowledge will help a person to move through the grief process for themselves and others.
Well, personally, I don't like the 5 stages of grief.
Okay.
Because grief is not a stage, it's a process.
Okay.
It's a lifelong process. But when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with those stages, when she identified them over 50 years ago, she was looking at commonality of how people respond to grief. And so one of the things that she came up with is that model, and it's anger, it's denial. If we go through the stages as she identified them in that order, and that was one of the problems with it because it's not a order, it's a progression. But she identified denial first, and that is the body's response and our way of responding to the intensity of hearing of the loss. We shock, just like you go into a shock, and the inability to kind of wrap this information around my head type of thing. That's kind of how you feel. And so once you begin to move out of that stage, you may go into anger. How did this happen? Anger takes itself in many, many forms. You can lash out those around you, depending on the death, and that affects the cause and the type of death or how it occurred. Affects the way people grieve. And so if the loss was through a murder, if the loss was, of course, you're going to be angry at maybe the justice system. You don't feel that they're pursuing the investigation strong enough, or the doctor didn't do enough, that type of thing. So anger becomes one of the most intense emotions in grief. And then there's bargaining, and so you try to understand. Okay, bargaining gives you the opportunity to try to put things back in control, because death takes everything out of control. And so you begin to bargaining. But maybe if I've done this, or maybe if I done that, or recognize this, and then you begin to maybe bargain with God. If I'm good enough, if you would save my loved one, or you would help me through this process. And so the bargaining can lead to depression. And I want to mention that the depression and grief, there's a lot of similarities, but it's different than the depression and mental health. Because the depression that comes with grief usually comes out of the situation, where mental health depression can be more clinically, more defined. Although there are similarities where you see the sadness, the prolonged sadness, the changes in physical, the lack of appetite, lack of sleep, or more sleep, or the lethargic in terms of responding, can't get out of the bed, can't do anything. So there are some similarities there, but the situations are different in terms of how the depression occurs. And then the last stage that she identified was acceptance. And you never accept it, So you just learn how to cope with it, and that's what we do at Griefshare. We provide a forum for people to come in and be able to begin to process that and learn some skills and some knowledge to help them cope with it. But you never accept it. You survive it. And the thing about the stages of grief, you go in and out of them. So you might not start with denial. You may go straight to anger, or you may go straight to depression, or you may start with bargaining. How did this happen? And so all those things affect the grieving process, but it doesn't have to go in those stages. Those are just things that were recognized as common things that people may experience in the grieving process.
Wow, that is really insightful. I think that the acceptance stage for children, I think, is probably the most difficult for them to understand, because of their, I guess, their immaturity, and because life is, it's so spontaneous, and a lot of times they don't know exactly how to deal with that. If you had to counsel with a child and you had to help them to come to terms with, or to bring closure to, the demise of a parent, what kind of advice, or what kind of counseling, or what kind of closure would you give the child?
Well, I think the most important thing with anyone who is grieving, that you give them the opportunity, give them permission to grieve. Okay. And that's very important, that they have permission. And so with the child, you give them the permission, and you give them the opportunity to talk about it if they want to. You use any kind of skills or activities that you can to get children to start talking about their feelings and how they feel, to get an understanding of what happened. But the most important thing with anyone who's going through grief is the opportunity to be able to talk about their loss. And for a lot of people, and even us as Christians, we're not comfortable with people talking about their losses. And so we equate, if they're angry, and especially if they're angry at God, that they have no faith, their lack of faith, they don't, where is your trust in God? And so a lot of times we as Christians don't talk about grief because we don't want people to feel that we don't have faith. And even in a church this size, the people that come to Griefshare, each session that we run it, we probably get 8 from 10, and people that come and participate. And a lot of people come from other churches because in their church they don't want people to know that they're not handling their grief right. They're not walking in faith, and they don't want people to criticize them. And so we say things such as, he's in or she's in a better place, or you just need to trust God. And people mourn that they don't want to know that. They miss that person now, being in another place. Why isn't he not here now? And they take those questions to God. And so we don't give them the support to walk that faith journey, because we give them other kind of messages that you shouldn't be angry at God. I remember when my mother passed, one of my older sisters was 10. She was 9 at that time. And she wrote God a letter and stuck it in the Bible. Now, we were raised in a legalistic church, and so one of the church mothers who was helping my dad with us at that time found the letter in the Bible and spanked her, because she don't question God, And so that's the message she got as a child, about trying to understand the loss of a mother. And so we send those conflicting messages even to Christians as adults now. You don't question God, but yet the Bible gives us the Psalms that we can cry out, we can lament, we can express, but we don't talk about that, or we don't talk about the examples of death in the Bible. When I think about Ruth and Naomi, Naomi was broken. When I think about Jesus, he faced death on the cross, and we don't talk enough about the Gethsemane experience. He knew what was coming. He agreed to it. But at that time, he asked God, if possible, take this cup from me. But then he conceded, but Yahweh will be done, because he knew that was it. So when we question the faith of others and we don't help them understand that God understands their pain, their loss, their hurt, and you can take them to him, you can cry out to him, then we kind of delay the healing process for them, especially with people of faith, because that's the only thing they have to hold on to. So we don't want to delay it. We don't want to disrupt it. We want to encourage it. And so support groups such as Griefshare give them the opportunity to do that in a confidential and a supportive system, so that they will feel the support and the encouragement of others, and feel this is a safe place. I can say those things I may not be able to say at home to my friends or my even my pastor or my Sunday school members or anything. I can say it here and not be judged. So providing support, whether for an adult or for a child, is very important in the healing process.
I'm familiar with this facility called Bow's Place, and they have a facility that's basically set up for the grieving process. And in touring that particular facility, I know that they have different rooms in the facility where you can go and express your grief. Can you share what kinds of help those particular rooms would actually offer to people who are going through grief? Because I've toured the place, and I see the rooms, and I understand that different emotions call for different settings, but I'm not really sure how that all comes into play.
I'm glad you mentioned Bow's Place, because I did volunteer from some years ago for Bow's Place, and so I'm quite familiar with it. What the setup is then to help provide activities for children to express different areas of grief that they may be experiencing. And so the activities are geared towards children, age appropriate, for them to share in a non-threatening way. They may look like games to us, or because we use those tools. We use the tools that children have. Play is an expression that children use to deal with life and to cope. And so we can also use that as a ways of helping them to deal with grief. So those type of activities to get children to thinking, drawing, writing, music, any of those things to express the grief that they're experiencing are ways to help them deal with them. And those are the same things with adults too. The things that are healthy to help them express grief. Because when I talked about grief and the different reactions to it, it's something that we didn't ask for. It's natural. It's a part of life. But how we walk through it emotionally, what are our feelings about it? Psychologically, what do we think? How do we think? How we process that thinking mentally? As well, that's the same as intellectually, but socially, some people isolate themselves. And so how do we interact and engage after we have a loss? All of those things, those ways are important that we not avoid, but we still start to engage so that we can function and get through life. And that's where the coping comes in, and that's where support comes in. And it's not easy to walk with someone who's had a loss. It's very painful. And so we try to say things to make them feel better, but a lot of times the things we say are harmful. Like or you'll get over it. It'll take time. Well, it's not that it doesn't take time, but it's the time that helps the healing, And so walking them with that time. Or you say things, I thought you were over that 3 years ago. So some of those things that we say, if a lady had a miscarriage, well, you're young enough, you can have another baby. Those kind of comments are not helpful. You don't replace a loved one. They're irreplaceable. And so when you say, like they're in a better place, or it was God's will, it's God's will for me to have this kind of pain. What kind of God is that? So how do you transfer a loving God when you're feeling so much pain? But we don't want to talk about that, So it takes a really unique person to be able to walk with someone who's grieving, to allow them permission to talk or not to talk, or just to sit with them, and just allow them to cry, because sometimes people can't receive other people's tears. And on that note too, men and women grieve differently. So we have to take that into consideration, especially in a family. Women tend to be more emotional and they want to talk about their feelings. Men are busy. They get busy and repress their feelings, because the society also dictates how we grieve. Society says, men, if you grieve and you weep, that's weak. And so a lot of men hold in things. They don't want to talk about it. And their buddies might come by and get them, let's go do something. Where you're, and so in a relationship, in a marriage, when you have those two different responses to grief, it can impact on the marriage, because the woman wants to talk about it and the man can't, or don't want to talk. And then they feel a sense of helplessness, and because they can't help, they can't fix that thing for their women. Men are fixers. They want to fix everything, so they can't fix it. And so it can cause a wedge in the marriage, because the needs are different, and the grief may be so intense that the inability to meet each other's needs can also impact as well. Now, you mentioned children, so imagine what the children in a marriage are if there's a grieving parent.
So if you were counseling with a person of faith, how would you help them to come to terms with a grief or a loss? What kinds of things what kind of advice could you give them?
Well, the first one, I would give them permission to grieve. And I would give them the assurance that God understands their grief, And I would give them permission to be angry with God, because, we don't want to talk about being angry. Like I said, my sister learned at 9 that you don't question God. And we do, And so to let them know it's okay to do that, because they have to go through that process. They have to go through the whys. They have to go through that they don't feel God. And you have to give them permission to do that too, because that's what happens, that in the loss, they feel that God is absent. How can you be a loving God? See, it's a contradiction. As a loving God, but you inflicted this pain on me, and so to be able to question God, to lament. I constantly advise them to read some of the Psalms and just see how David handled his grief, and so to understand that God understands your pain. God understands your pain. He created us with emotions, so He's equipped to handle it. And you can, He Himself, if He created us in emotions, He showed that He had some righteous indignation when He was, how we behave. So if He gets angry, He allows us to get angry. But He tells us we can be angry. See, a lot of people miss that. He gives us permission to be angry, but He says, sin not. Mm-hmm. And that's where the support comes in, to help them not to find other different coping mechanisms that may be detrimental to them and harm our temple. God wants us still to take care of it. So we have to lament. So we give them permission. That's the first thing, that you can be angry. You can, and they say, I don't feel God. So what do? Encourage you to continue to read the Bible, whether you feel or not. Continue. We provide devotionals in the Griefshare. There's a workbook where we encourage them to daily do an activity. You keep doing it until you feel the presence of God, that you keep trusting even when you don't feel the presence of God. And the more you do it, the better you will feel. You begin to experience the caring and the loving and the compassionate God that we serve. And so people have to have permission to grieve, even if it's what we consider negative emotions, and understand that God is a loving and a caring God, and that He does care for you. But it's also our responsibility, if we're walking with that person, to give them that assurance when they don't feel it.
Is that the type of platform that Griefshare offers to those who come and they are needing support when there's a loss? What other kinds of things do you offer with regard to Griefshare?
Griefshare consists of 3 components. Okay. It's a video of experts that talk about the topics of grief. And there's 13 sessions, so there's 13 topics that they talk about. The challenges of grief, the journey of grief, why, heaven, anger, guilt. So there's topics in that 13-week process that the experts address on the video. Usually they're 30 to 40 minutes long. And then there's discussion. And that's where the support comes in. And that's where we as facilitators kind of facilitate the discussion by asking questions and allowing people to have the opportunity to talk. And we give them permission to be silent if they don't want to talk, but just to be in the presence of other people who are grieving. Even though people do it differently, there's still some similarities. And so to be able to recognize that and feel, okay, I am okay when I'm feeling this way. And so we do the support, and then they have what we call homework, which are daily devotionals for them. And we strongly encourage them to do that, whether they feel the presence of God or the absence of God. Because when you keep on doing those things, those scriptures are going to speak to you. And so those are the components that Griefshare offers, and the support from others that are grieving is from us, the facilitators. So it gives people a coping tool and gives them tools that we call it a toolbox that they can begin to go to. And we strongly push, because it is curriculum based, that number one toolbox is God. Even when you feel His absence, you don't feel His presence, or you don't pray. We encourage prayer. And they say, I don't feel like praying. I can't pray. Well, see, that's where we intercede, and they need to know that there's other people praying for them. Because if I can't pray, I'm just so intense and in pain, and I don't feel the presence of God. They need to know that somebody else is praying for them. So those are all the components that work in Griefshare. And sometimes people come back. They'll go through the 13-week and then they'll come back because they say, I'm in a different place and I hear things differently now. And I got the permission to grieve, and now I'm coming back to hear how I can do that.
One other question that I definitely wanted to ask you. I know that with Griefshare, you said that it's a 13-week program, so that calls for a commitment. How do you get someone who is grieving, and let's say they're grieving intensely, how do you get them to commit to 13 weeks of, I guess, deprogramming that intensity?
We ask them to make at least a 3-week.
Okay, at least
begin. And the thing about Griefshare, you can come in at any time. So you don't have to start with the first. The first session is normal, because we want people to understand that what you're going through is okay. It is normal. I think there's a 2-page in there with over 50 different reactions people have to grief. 50. Some reactions that people have to grief. And we just think, it's sad, it's depression, they're angry. 52, I think it is, descriptions or reactions that you can have. So we tell people come at least 3 times, and we encourage them to come 3 times. And usually that's they can make that commitment afterwards, because they begin to feel, okay, this is a safe place for me to talk. This is a safe place for me to come. And people understand. And we give them permission to grieve. Come, and if you don't do anything but cry, nobody's going to bother you. If you just sit there whole hour and a half and cry and you don't talk, that's okay. Because what happens is you hear something, and that's why people come back, because they hear something, and then they come back again and they said, I didn't hear that. I was in a different state in my grief, that I didn't hear that the last time. I want to come back, and they come back and they may bring somebody back with them. So the commitment is just 3 sessions, and usually they're hooked.
That's wonderful. Is there a way of, I guess, separating the types of losses? Like, you said there's divorce, there's relationship loss, there are losses from physical health and other things. Is there a way that Griefshare isolates, or do you counsel with people separately, depending on the kind of loss that they've experienced?
Griefshare specifically for the loss of a loved one through death.
Okay.
They do have another program called Divorce Care, but we just concentrate on the loss of a loved one through death. It's just not good to put them all together.
No.
But some people do. Some people say, you lost, you can go here. And we have to tell them we're just concentrating on death. But grief is just a reaction, as I mentioned before, about how you respond to a loss. And so a lot of the similarities and things that we people, how they react, is also the same way they react to any other kind of loss. And so in counseling with them, the similarities are the same. You have to be there to listen, So when you tell somebody whose house was flooded out, you can get another one, girl, well, God will give you another one. He blessed you with that one. He blessed you with another one. That can be painful. And so if you're not showing that, okay, you grateful or you appear ungrateful, then that's will affect how you grieve. So I always tell people, because anybody who goes through grief needs a good support system, whether it's if your spouse or your loved one or someone is incarcerated, because there's shame. So you got to pick up who you talk to or who you say. Like when we had the AIDS epidemic, people didn't talk about loved ones that died of AIDS. Suicide. People feel rejected, because that's an uncomfortable situation to talk about. People feel isolated. They feel guilty. I should have been in. A lot of self-blame and stuff. So you have to pick who you choose to talk to about that. And a lot of times you have to refer people out to get professional help, depending on the intensity of pain. So those type of losses require maybe different kind of support systems, and just helping people find those support systems. But the main thing is listening, being available, and helping them to choose. A lot of friendships end because of the inability of a, quote, friend to understand someone's loss. So sometimes people have to make new friends. They have to move on to different relationships where they can find the support that they need, even within the family. So sometimes we tell them you just have to identify who you can go to and who you should avoid.
One thing that you said very interesting at the onset of this podcast was that grief is a lifelong process. Mm-hmm. How do you get people who are grieving to understand that it is a lifelong process and that they're going to deal with it really for the rest of their lives? How do you get them to understand that?
Giving them the permission to grieve, because what happens is that people want to put it on a time frame, and you can't do that. Now with children, and with my own experience, children grieve through developmental stages. And so I can remember,
that's interesting.
When I was a young adult, that I really had intense grief for the loss of my mother. As I tried to manipulate and go through adulthood, womanhood, I wanted my mother. I had some significant other women in my life, but I wanted my mother to help me navigate that path, to share the birth of my children, to share and form and plan a wedding with me. So it was different moments in my life where I had intense grief. I'd go back and do my grief work. Because I miss my mother. So when you understand that grief, particularly with children, is a developmental, as they go through developmental stages, they'll go back and do some grief. So when you don't do those things, it's going to come up. The next death, subsequent deaths will raise the unresolved things that you didn't take care of in initial significant loss. So, and the same with adults. So if you didn't get permission to grieve when you lost that loved one, and then you have another loss, and you have, it's really confusing and scary to allow people that these emotions come back up. So understanding that you'll miss that person, anniversaries, holidays, significant events. And you realize that significant person is not here to share this, trying to establish a new identity. There's so many factors that impact on grief. Who am I after I lose a spouse? Am I married or not? Do I hang out with the same people? I feel like a fifth wheel. They may try to, they may encourage me to come to dinner or something, but I don't feel the same. I feel awkward, So having to redefine your identity, having to financially, becomes a big issue, So all those things impact. So helping people to know that it is it's a lifelong process, and just being able to use the tools to cope with it is what's going to help people get through it.
That is absolutely, insightful, because I think a lot of people think that once you've gotten through the burial of that person, that it's over, or it should be over, and you should move on to finding closure. And you're sharing with us today that closure does not take place because it is a lifelong process, and it's a matter of finding your way.
Finding your way
without that person, coping with that.
Now, what kind of coping skills do you have to help you get through that journey of grief?
And that's wonderful. Now, the other question, and I know that we're going to be coming to a close, but the other question that I would like to ask you about relates to the coping skills. What kinds of coping skills would a person need if they have experienced this great loss, and they do understand that they're going to go through it for the rest of their lives? What kinds of coping skills would they need in order to make it through with some semblance of success in that arena?
Well, The one thing is, I mentioned acceptance, and you never accept it, so you learn to live with it. And so you do that one day at a time, one day at a time, because people want to jump ahead. And they've already overwhelmed themselves not only with the loss, but the survivor. And so, anxiety is high. And when we know that the Bible tells us about being anxious and leave the anxiety for tomorrow, because we can't handle it today.
Yes.
And so helping them to see that there's one day at a time, and that this is something that can't be rushed, and how they have to lean into their grief. You can't jump in it, you lean into it, and just knowing that, if you make that to-do list and you only get 2 things done, that's success. So those little things, it's really the little things that help make the big thing possible, that you can walk through it, that you can survive, you can get through. But you have to have some accomplishments on the little things, and see that and feel good about those things before you can embrace the whole thing that I'm going to be well. You're going to be okay. You're going to learn how to live with this loss. And that's just part of your life now.
Well, lastly, I'd like to ask you if there is any other insight that you'd like to share with us regarding the grief process and what a person needs in order to grieve and to grieve the way that is helpful and healthy. Is there any other anything else that you would like to add or to offer to someone who is going through the grief process? And then tell us a little bit about Griefshare, when they meet and that kind of thing, and we can...
Okay, I would like to reiterate the importance of finding support.
Okay.
Do not attempt to walk through this process of grief by yourself. Do not try to do that. So support in the form of friends or family. It can come from other places, So maybe you might have a coworker at work who might be giving you a little guidance, assistance, but the support, not to try to walk this alone. And that's what we do at Griefshare. So we give that support. We give you that encouragement. You're not walking alone. Currently, we're in our 6th season here at the Church of Bethel's Family. And we do a special session during the holidays, surviving the holidays, because that's also a very painful time for people. And so we will be doing that on November the 18th this year. And that's a Thursday. We meet on Thursdays. We're still meeting on Zoom. And we meet 7 o'clock to 8:30. And to participate with us, they would need to call me, or they can go to griefshare.org. And we have a website. We have and they can list us as Bethel's Family, and it will take them straight to us, so they can register and how they can get their book and join us. So that's as simple as that. So register online or call me.
That's wonderful, and I think it's wonderful that you have this instrument in place to help people to navigate through the grief and the losses that they may encounter in life. Because in all honesty, most people don't see it as a process, and they definitely don't see it as a lifelong process.
Right.
So it's definitely information that they would need to know, and we need to help, I guess, everyone that we know who has encountered grief how to access the support that they need in order to make it through those situations. So thank you so very much for joining us today. All that you've said has been, so helpful. And I know that just from personal experience, a lot of the things that you bore witness to, I can definitely connect to that, because I can see the natural stages that we've gone through just based on my own personal experiences with death and with loss. So I think that one of the most important things that you said was, in all thy getting, get an understanding. Get an understanding as to what grief is, as to how to move through the process of grieving, and how to help and support other people who are experiencing the same type of thing. So I want to to thank you so much for joining us at Studio B. Thank you also to our audience who has come forth and you've joined us today. I hope that if you know someone who is going through the grieving process, that you can definitely refer them to Paulette Bray. She definitely is an expert on the grieving process and what types of things need to be implemented in order to help someone to transfer from a state of grief to a state of acceptance and how to cope with grief. So thank you again for joining us in Studio B today. I say thank you from Pastor Marcus D. Holman. Thank you also to Paulette Bray for sharing with us, and thank you for joining us. If you have joined us through Facebook, through Twitter, I want you to go back out, like us. Please share the information with other people, because Studio B is exposing you to great things. So we look forward to seeing you again on Studio B. Thank you, thank you, thank you.